course, have been researching the emotional reactions that people have to deaths over social media, specifically those that fans have to celebrities over Facebook. To break down our information, we looked at parasocial relationships, or one-sided relationships, and how these allow fans to connect with celebrities beyond the computer screen. So we also broke them down into two different categories: acceptable and non-acceptable deaths. By breaking our information down like this, we were able to collect a lot of data and information on the attitudes, perceptions, and future behaviors that people will have towards these deaths over social media. And we also just wanted to note that our findings, though they were really interesting, it contrasted heavily with previous researchers' findings, and our intentions were to further research.
So we had two hypotheses that we came up with. The first one is that people will react with positive emotions to acceptable deaths on social media, and the other one is that people will react with negative emotions for non-acceptable deaths on social media. And so we had four key concepts. The first one is our types of death, and there are two types of death, which are acceptable and non-acceptable. So acceptable deaths are those in which people pass away from things like illness, old age, kind of things that are out of your control. And studies have showed that social media users are more likely to express more emotion towards acceptable deaths rather than non-acceptable. And then the other type of death is non-acceptable, and those are deaths in which people pass away from things like drug overdose, drunk driving, suicide, things like that. And studies actually showed that mourners grieving a non-acceptable death feel that the process is actually restrained or kind of like unsupported by society, since it's such a controversial way to pass. And then the second key concept are parasocial relationships. So a parasocial relationship is a one-way relationship with someone else over social media, and they're very popular today since we have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything. And the internet provides 24-hour access to anyone, so people are building these virtual one-way relationships with people who they have never actually met before.
Our third key concept was social media mourning of celebrity deaths, and internet is changing the way that we mourn deaths and connect with the deceased, and it's allowed for us to create memorial pages to memorialize and preserve the deceased, in this case deceased celebrities. And social media is increasingly becoming a public outlet for public mourning, especially for avid fans of the celebrity. And our fourth key concept was emotions in mourning, and this deals with the parasocial relationships that Marissa talked about. Even though with parasocial relationships you don't have a personal relationship with the deceased, it can still create emotional reactions and responses. And typically during periods of increased emotions, individuals are less reserved in sharing their feelings, so they're more open and they're going to post about it and share their feelings openly. And although these parasocial relationships don't involve direct communication, they can still cause deep felt emotional responses.
So for our experiment, we created 16 Facebook posts that showed acceptable and non-acceptable deaths, and we shared it on the mail system and on Facebook with friends and family. The experiment was on Qualtrics, and it was opened during March and closed in April. So the type of design is a 2x2x4 design, and the 2x2 is the acceptable, non-acceptable deaths, and the strong ties and weak ties. And then the 4 design is the message within the subject experiment. So our strength of our experiment were participants were their own control group, and they all saw the messages in a controlled repetition manner. So the independent variables that we controlled were acceptable and non-acceptable deaths, and strong tie and weak tie. And strong ties are family or friends that know the deceased, and weak ties are like from watching movies but have no real connection with them. So we manipulated the 16 Facebook posts. There were 4 acceptable strong ties, 4 acceptable weak ties, 4 non-acceptable strong ties, and 4 non-acceptable weak ties. To illustrate acceptable and non-acceptable deaths, we controlled likes. 100 or more was acceptable death, and 100 or less than 100 likes was a non-acceptable death.
For our research, we had 3 dependent variables. These variables were involvement, attitudes, and emotions. However, for this particular experiment, we decided to focus on the emotions of our participants. We measured this by using the Bradley and Lang 1994 scale, and we arranged it from 1 to 9 to get how strong the emotional response was and how weak the emotional response was. For our sample and response rates, we had 150 volunteers over the age of 18. Most of these volunteers were college students, and they were mostly female compared to male. We recruited these participants by using the Male Research Lab and also by using Facebook. The participants who currently use social media were our main target. We wanted to make sure they were using social media so that way we can get a sense of what their emotional response was and if they were exposed to social media deaths. 85% of these participants used Twitter and 97% of them used Facebook.
So to analyze our results, we use the SPSS system, specifically the paired sample t-test, which compares the significance of the means of the 2 components. The test was used because each participant was exposed to every level of the independent variables. To have a significant finding, the p-value has to be less than 0.05, which means every 5 out of 100 is your probability of an error, whereas ours was 0.32, which means every 32 out of 100 you're going to find an error, so there was no significant finding according to the data, but we interpreted and used human analysis to find some interesting results. So with the paired samples t-test and the emotional means, to non-acceptable emotional means was 87.31, and the acceptable emotional mean was 86.72, so you can see that they were really close and it didn't necessarily depend on the type of death regarding their emotional response. According to the data, we had a pretty good bell curve for frequency of seeing posts on social media about death. However, you can see that almost 80% not at all posted about death or reacted to it, in comparison to a little over 70% likeliness to use social media. So they were seeing everything and being on social media, but they weren't interacting with the death posts.
Our results were interesting in a way that they diverged from previous related research. For example, for previous related research, if a celebrity died a non-acceptable way, participants would have negative emotions or be less empathetic towards that celebrity. But in our results, it showed that the participants didn't really care about how the celebrity died, and so that created there was no significant difference for the emotions of non-acceptable and acceptable deaths. And we had some limitations in our experiment. Since the experiment used closed-ended questions, participants weren't allowed to fully give a meaningful answer. Also, we had no control of the environment in which the participant took the experiment, and this could create confounding variables, and then it could create different results.
Along with these limitations, we also experienced a little bit of a researcher bias in the fact that we manipulated the Facebook posts so that they could coincide with our hypothesis. For example, we did strong and weak ties, and then we also adjusted the likes, as Brittany mentioned earlier, to where 100 and above came from an acceptable death, and then non-acceptable deaths experienced less than 100. We also had a participant bias in the fact that we don't know participants' perceptions on certain celebrities. So, for example, if you had one participant who had a negative perception of, per se, models. And we happened to post a celebrity image of a model. Their emotional reaction, emotional response to that may vary towards the population's response to that celebrity death. Furthermore, we had a generalization from our participants. We had a 90% of our participants were female, which could greatly skew our studies in the fact that we all know that females react differently and have a different emotional response than males. In order to contribute to further research, our data provided insight that the type of death does not necessarily affect how people mourn celebrities online through the use of social media. Whether it's non-acceptable or acceptable, rather than focusing on the type of death, they choose to highlight the memories and accomplishments of celebrities, which is different from an independent death, to whereas if it was a friend or a relative, you may focus more on the how, what, when, where. We hope that our research will contribute to future research in the fact that they can start new experiments and new studies from a new hypothesis. Thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, the floor is now open.